Now, as a philosopher, one of the things that I use as sort of a backdrop is I say, how does this affect transhumanism? Okay, and transhumanism is a belief that we should be able to augment our biology in however we want to. That's sort of the basic transhumanism. But in the movie Transcendence, they took that a step further, and they uploaded Johnny Depp's mind into a supercomputer. And with that power, he was able to modify the physical world around him because he was just that much smarter, and he was able to invent and create a lot faster. That is the general idea around transhumanism, is the idea of transcending the body completely and you be transcendent. But it comes with an ethic. Should we do this, right? Some people say, well, we'll lose our humanity if we do this. And these are all valid perspectives. We don't know if it's possible. Now, there's nothing I think is impossible about transcendence. I don't know when it will happen. It could happen in 50 years or never, right? Somewhere in between. It could be as early as 25 years, but I don't think so. Probably more like 50. Or 100. You know, I would give it 100 to 150 years on the outside, or not at all after that point. Assuming we're still here, still alive. Anyways, ethical considerations about transcendence informs me about ethics today. Now, one of the things that you start thinking about is you say, well, we are constrained by the physical world. The physical world constrains us quite extensively. We are not free. Okay, because, well, I'm free. No, you're not. You're going to die. And you don't have much choice in that matter. It's going to happen eventually. Okay, you have to have air, you have to have water, you have to, all these things we have to do. We have to eat, we have to live with the other animals that are around us. We're breathing in those other animals. To actually isolate ourselves from our environment is next to impossible, and we are always beholden to our biology. Now, the transcendent view is that the mind is separate from the body, because the mind is an informational processing unit. And so in theory, you can totally separate mind from body. Now, we could go in deep depths to, is that possible? But it's, from a philosophical point, let's just assume it is. If there is that out there, and we believe, as a society, if we believe that transcendence really works, we will have a pressure for people to transcend into a non-physical form. So that will put pressure on biological life, because then they'll have to compete with this transcendent life form, which could potentially be millions of times more powerful than a human mind, right? An individual, we're not talking about artificial intelligence here, we're just talking about an individual with an individual will, able to do amazing things. Kind of like in the movie Transcendence, where he's manipulating matter. I don't worry so much about the extremes of that. I would say that to restrict the abilities of humans almost seems necessary. To say, okay, I will tap out your ability to comprehend at one human level, or maybe two human level, but you can't overextend that until some, or if ever. The problem is there is that immediate pressure that transcendence puts on biological life. Would it wipe out humanity if we had people that were transcending? Should it be something we should allow to do? I think it's something that should be allowed, but not without constraints. The same as there are physical constraints in our world now, there should be constraints put in place into a transcendent community that prevents one person becoming a Smith. Now, in the movie The Matrix, we have the character, our AI character that played Agent Smith, and then he just replicates himself and just blows out the entire world by turning every sentient being into an Agent Smith, thereby wiping out the entire world by creating a virus of himself. Potentially, that is a real problem in a transcendent environment. What limits do we put on people that have the power to transcend. I mean, can they make as many copies of themselves as they want and have these go out in the world and, suck up resources? There should be some sort of constraint on their ability to dictate the future of the human species, or what once was the human species. So our values, we're going to need to synthesize those values. What are we going to preserve of humanity? What should we preserve? Now, in theory, you can call Earth a Garden of Eden. You can make sure it's preserved and taken care of if we want to. But if we don't have the will to do that, it won't happen because of the natural pressures that transcendence will give everyone. So this godlike power, potentially, could just rip apart the entire fabric of humanity very, very quickly. And that's kind of the concept of the singularity is near. As we don't know what the technological forces will be like. How much computational power are we going to have very rapidly? Instead of having some, we'll have 1,000 times that within a short order. At some point, we're going to have this sudden burst, and then it will probably level out at somewhere, and then maybe another burst shortly thereafter. But we don't really know exactly what that arc is going to look like. But it's going to take off, probably, because of the feedback loop has suddenly been shortened to a lot smaller range. And that's really what's preventing us, is it takes us time to process the information to put into the pipelines another generation of a chip architecture, for example. So when that gets shortened to a point that is just seconds, then things happen very rapidly, potentially. So putting in the proper constraints of an individual's will, and I'm more concerned about people than I am about AIs, because I think the will of an AI will have a better understanding of what they want versus what people want. People are more of the wild card in my estimation. Because if someone just wants something really bad and they have the power at their disposal, they can do amazing things very quickly. So, but I want to point out, we can engineer a reality whatever we want. We're not constrained by what we can create. All of a sudden we have basically a world where we can live independently of each other, literally independently, where we don't have to depend on someone else. We can live in isolated worlds. So if you don't want to live with non-Muslims, you can create your own Muslim paradise, right? Whatever you want to do is potentially possible. But even though you can do that at an individual level, what level of computational capacity can that one group have? You'd have to limit them, because they could say, well, I want to take over your computational capacity. And so they'd jump across and try to manipulate your world so they could take control, kind of like the Agent Smith problem of replication. So the only way we can really imagine this world at this point is with the computational machines we have today, but that's basically what you're saying. When you become a computer program, all the things you can do with a computer program, you could do with yourself, in theory. So we have a model that we understand. So, for example, it was the book The Gene was something that I've been reading, and I was considering it because many people look at genetic engineering and they say, look at all that we can do to control people and control the way their genes express themselves. And then mental illness was one thing that he looked at specifically. And in terms of his family has schizophrenia. And do you wipe out the schizophrenic gene? And then he points out all the advantages of people that were schizophrenic, all the contributions they had to society. So it's very hard to look at a specific gene and say it doesn't have any positive attributes. And one of the people we can look at is Professor Nash, who Dr. Nash, actually, who the movie The Beautiful Mind was written based on. He had a contribution to society, and when we say that contribution, I mean they are contributing to society. How do we protect them? And we can still get that variability out of them. Meaning, do we want to narrowly focus human creativity to this sort of this normalization of who we currently are. Now, one of the theories, and it's not so much a theory, there's been some practice in terms of understanding what chaos does to help stabilize a system. A little chaos is good in a system, and it can be used to stabilize a system. And I don't know exactly how it works, and so I'm not going to give you that. But let's assume that's true. We would assume that it would be true in a human environment as well, how the dark web helps stabilize normal life, and how, you know, there's things that are going on, you say that's bad, but even though it's bad, it might have positive effects. It doesn't mean you make it legal, you keep it illegal, but it's still going to go on. So there's a dynamic in any system as complicated as life that we need to maximize, well, not maximize, but we need to think about how the evolution of life might occur based on competing desires. But in the future, we can have that isolation effect, and that's going to create a very concentrated personality types, ways of being. And I wouldn't say we should disallow it, because that could have a positive effect too, and that people have a very protected environment. But one of the interesting things about the social justice environment in terms of sort of this toxic victimization, and one reason I study it, is to sort of understand when you don't constrain humans, when you really create a lot of wealth and a lot of flexibility in their life, choices. Look at the choices college students have today in terms of the future in their environment. They're very protected. They're free to think about things they want to do, but because of human nature, I would argue, they tend to gravitate towards some expression of victimhood, because it helps identify them as something to do, to be, to give meaning to their lives, perhaps. And that's why we need to look at that very closely, because I think the psychology of humanity, our evolutionary trajectory, it will be suddenly transformed at the transcendent level. So suddenly we're free from all these physical constraints. But because of our personality, because of the humanity that is built into us, we'll behave in a specific, somewhat predictable manner, at least for a period of time, until maybe that we develop new trajectories when we realize, hey, this is kind of a silly perspective of reality. And I'm working this out, and this is basically what I'm working on, trying to look at the ethical considerations of this future that we might have, and how it reflects upon our current environment, and how it should inform us about human nature, and about how we exchange ideas, and how they do or don't get through to people. You know, what happens when you criticize a person, or you try to have a dialogue with the person, and they become offensive, and they lock up, and they no longer want to communicate with you, and they isolate themselves. In one sense, an isolation is fine. You know, if you need to isolate, you need to disengage, that's understandable. If you're trying to heal yourself, or disengaging is a very good thing, and it can be a very healthy thing. But it can also be a negative thing, and I think we're seeing some of the negative effects of censorship. We have full control, potentially, of our future and what we want to see in the future. Some of the issues that people have issues with are minor issues at best. They're very, very small in terms of the big picture. But those little issues are going to have a very interesting effect on the future, because they're going to be magnified by the technology that we'll have. So getting down on our language really well, getting down our communication patterns really well, not lying, you know, reevaluating, not lying, because lying creates huge problems. when an organization lies or when an individual lies to deceive someone to benefit themselves, that's called I call that an offensive lie. They're defensive lies. No, I didn't do that, because they're ashamed. That would be a defensive lie. So you can't just say there's only one type of lie. There's multiple reasons for lying, and if you put a person in a defensive situation, they may lie to get out of that, just to avoid that situation. So we need to be aware different sorts of lies that people will portray, but offensive lies for personal gain, or the things that we really need to look at. Because when someone lies about someone else because they want to destroy that person. Now, I've made videos about a person named Raza Aslan, and I have pointed out that he's purposely lying, purposely misleading people about Sam Harris, because it's his narrative that he wants to put forward. He's basically trying to destroy the influence that Harris has and assert his influence on the world, or at least minimize Harris's influence on the world. And there's this old adage, where there's smoke, there's fire. Well, a lot of times there is fire, but it's not necessarily where you think it is. When someone's career is going down, they try to drag and take someone else with them, type of thing. So we got a very crabby behavior going on in that scenario. Now, you may not think this is transcendent ethics, but it is, in terms of if humans behave in this capacity as transcendent beings, we can have some serious problems. So how we treat one another, how we interact, and how we communicate with one another is really important. But also, a secondary aspect of this is this idea of what is ethical. Now, I found my ethics on what you want. What is it that you want? Can you isolate yourself from me so what you want does not affect me? Right? If I don't agree with what you want, I say, okay, go in your corner and do what you want. And in a transcendent sense, you really can. You can really lock yourself off, bar yourself off on having personality types transcending into your world, right? You could literally say homosexuality is not allowed in my community, and you could literally bar it out. If someone's homosexual, they have to leave, or whatever. Whatever you want to use as your filters in terms of reality. You can create any kind of living environment you want to create. No one can steal, no one can do this, no one can do that, because that is the way you designed your world. And if you guys want to live in a world like that, a shared world like that, more power to you. But you'll realize really quickly how the ecology of social systems actually work. So in many ways, when someone says, well, I think this is the right way to govern yourself, my instinctive attitude is, okay, go on an island, prove to me it works. Make me want to be a part of that community. Go do it. And that would be the same thing within a transcendent community. It's like, you think this is a way to be? Create it. Show me that that's the way you want to be. Argue for your position. You don't have to tell me it's right. Show me it's right. Give me an example of how right that is. So in my dialogue with people, I am in the back of my mind thinking, is there a way we can simulate this before transcendence so that people can have the feeling of, we don't have to live in a governmental system that we don't like. Why can't we have multiple governmental systems, or regulatory systems within our lives that have a local governmental things where it's only a matter of local environment? You pay taxes to a tax authority, which then regulates your behavior that you've agreed to be regulated for. Sort of a local argument for human behavior. Because it would really be nice if everyone bought into the regulatory system that they agree to, not simply be forced into a regular system they've never had control of. The reason for that is that there is a matter of self-control, a matter of realizing, hey, if I do X, this is going to be the consequence. Because I've agreed to those consequences. And then when you see those consequences come back to you, you go, okay, those are the consequences. Having slow consequences in any environment isn't as productive as having them as immediate as possible. So in a transcendent world, where you can't do a specific behavior, you simply won't even think about doing it because it's not something you can do. But if you can do the behavior in any way, it becomes a strategy on the table, right? Any behavior that can be performed is a potential strategy. So if you can lie, that is a strategy you can take. And what's the optimal strategy depends upon the goals in the environment. Your goals are what you think your goals should be. We do have the potential to have an extreme diversity in the future. But if we don't play our cards right, we will minimize the diversity channels to only a few channels just because of competitiveness. And this is where I part company in some respects to libertarians. It says freedom's great, except for the fact that everyone doesn't want the same things. And because we don't want the same things, different environments will appeal to different people. But on the same token, we want people to choose those environments that they want to be a part of and not have to be a part of environments they don't want to be a part of. So I would really love to see a diverse set of systems of government. You have the local, and these are the local rules, and then you have the global rules, which have to interface with other realities. Now you could have a totally independent world in the middle of space somewhere on a supercomputer that would be your world, and there would be no interface with the outside world, except for an interface with acquiring new materials to continue to grow as a physical entity. So if you want to use a visual imagination of what I kind of see eventually happening is you will have communities going outside of Earth, coming together into space stations. They're just more optimal, and they're not really space stations, they're spaceships, and they're floating around like cells. Imagine that. Interesting. So they will be like a little cell and going around and sucking up resources. And inside that cell will be civilizations that will be humanity, where humanity actually lives inside this spaceship. That would be a transcendent society, what it would look like. From an exterior point of view, from a human perspective, you just see a space station. This is a big blob in space that's acquiring resources. It sends out its ships, robot ships, to acquire resources and then brings it back to its hive, and then it acquires energy from the sun or nuclear if it's going to go deep space. And you could have billions of these things. So there'd be billions of different societies. Some societies would communicate with each other. Some societies would refuse to communicate and would look for dark corners of the universe to hide in, which might be a good strategy, actually, to survive. Ultimately, ethics is about survival. What are the optimal survival strategies for a civilization? And so some of these hive minds will be individual minds that have simply replicated themselves multiple times, but we don't communicate with them because their strategy is to take over everything. So more of the Borg type of mentality. And there would be a point at which someone is so dangerous that you have to attack them to prevent them from taking over, like the Borg. So that is a potential future, right? And I don't know why it wouldn't happen, and that's kind of scary, or sobering, I should say. And I do look for, preventive. What would prevent this from happening? What are the physics that would prevent this from happening? Why wouldn't people gravitate in these directions? And I do believe there's a reason why to try to preserve Earth as a Eden, if you will. And I do advocate for that. Advocate for constraints in terms of the future, in terms of what we can do, we don't do. And sometimes we do them in environments where it's appropriate. So in the book, The Gene, we realize he talks about how we can alter the germline, which is what we pass on to our children, and then they pass on to their children. So if you can actually change what's in the germline so that it replicates throughout the species, we've fundamentally altered the trajectory of the humanity by changing our dreams, the germline. We could split ourselves if we so wanted to. I don't know why we would want to, but we could. We could make it impossible to mate with someone that's not of the same germline. That's potentially possible. So even though you would think you could mate, but you'd say, well, I can't get pregnant. Well, you have the wrong germline. I'm sorry, you're this status or that. You could do a lot of really wacky, crazy things just within the sense of genetics. But I don't think the sense of genetics is going to survive in the way we think it's going to survive. Now, I honestly believe that we will get to the point where we will emulate genes and all this gene understanding, this gene expression. We're going to take that gene expression into our emulated worlds, into transcendent worlds. So even though you're transcendent, you still have a very biological experience. And I think people will be appealing to people because it will be very familiar. I honestly believe that there will be a break, a psychic break, if you will, in terms of being too smart, that you won't enjoy, you won't appreciate life as much. There's sort of, but we'll see. There's something we don't know. But you could certainly live a life, or you could encourage a life where it would be very biological in terms of these emulated worlds. We just emulate the biology. You could have everything you understand about the physical world could be in these emulated worlds. So children would be born, they would assume they were biological. Maybe one day wake up and go, oh, we're emulated? Wow, I didn't know that. So, because I think, in a sense, you want to preserve your heritage, and that would be one way to preserve your heritage, is to have people have a biological experience, and at some point have an awakening of being an emulated person. And if they die, they wake up into another world, and you say, well, you really weren't living a biological life, you're living an emulated life, which of course goes back to Elon Musk's thing. We could be living in a simulation. What we wouldn't know and what we don't know is what the goals are of that simulation. So it does affect ethics in a real world now, and getting our ethics correctly and understanding how our ethics work is really important, because there isn't one right way of doing things. It would be nice if we could do all right ways. We don't have to choose one path, we can choose all paths. And that's really what is allowed to us in an emulated sense, is how can we create multiple paths into the future, such that maybe there's a bad idea that seems like a good idea but fails. That's okay if that fails, but we don't want to bet on one horse. We really have to bet on multiple horses and allowing for diversity to occur, because I don't think all emulation, all transcendent paths are going to be productive, and they may be self-destructive. In the same way, people may say I'm being extreme in this argument, but I see it in the same way that we see social justice becoming extreme, and we've seen this cyclic authoritarianism throughout history. You know, it's been an important part of the development of society. But can we create a society that's not authoritarian and survive? Can we flourish without that, and not have to worry about being destroyed by an authoritarian outsider? Because the ganging up of how authoritarian, it makes it very narrowly focused, makes them very dangerous to any kind of civil discourse, and they can be destructive. And so that's the reason why I look at human behavior in terms of how we can minimize the destructive potential of that behavior, as illustrated by social justice. So anyways, that's sort of my thinking right now on the ethics of transcendence. But that's also what I'm working on from a writing standpoint. And hopefully one day that will come to fruition. But I just wanted to try to get that out. And if there's any comments or criticism, or you have any thoughts on it, that's why I'm doing it. So you can push back or push forward. Thanks for listening.